Hello friends and fashion lovers, welcome and welcome back. Thank you for clicking on this video. In this video I will be showing you how to make this alternate circle dress. To make this dress I'm using 3 yards of Ankara fabric and a fusible interface, which is optional. If you have a sleeveless bodice block, your work is reduced, but if you don't have a sleeveless bodice block, don't worry, I've got you covered. Let's quickly draft one. And the measurements you need to draft this are displayed on the screen. So using my top line as my shoulder line, I'm going to start drafting. So to have the chest line, subtract 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch from your chest line measurement. So now that you have done that, go ahead and mark half of your shoulder width measurement, then the standard neckline. Mark your shoulder slope, then connect all your mark points. Next is to adjust the neckline to your desired neck width. So I want a 4-inch neck width right there. And mark your neck depth, your desired neck depth. So on the chest line, mark 1/4 of your round chest measurement plus ease. The ease is optional anyway, but depending on how free you want it to be. So I have about 1/4 of an inch ease. Next is to find the midpoint of a armhole length and go in by 3/4 of an inch. This is for the front and reconnect to form the armhole. Now extend the chest line measurements or your bust circumference down. So it's time to mark our collar width. So you can make this smaller, you can make this wider. I decided to go with a 2.75 width. So after marking it, curve it with anything that will aid you with the curve. So now it's time to connect to form our halter neck. You can take the across front measurements, you can decide to use whatever style you do. But I always love to come down by 1/2 inch from this neckline, place my mark there and connect. This gives me sort of a conservative look, if I may say so. So that is for the halter neck. So go ahead and add your seaming allowance to your pattern now. So with this, you are pretty much done. But in case you are a bit busty, you want to do well to mark your cross front and be sure that you are properly covered. So it all depends on what you want. By reducing the length of the chest line has given you certain kind of coverage to avoid gapping. So you want to note that the collar will be cut on fold. The back, I decided that my neck depth will be 1.5 inch, while the neck width will be same as the front, which was 4 inches. You can use the same as your front neck depth and width, but just make sure that it's something that you like. So the collar will be pretty much the same width because it starts from the front to the back. So that's 2.75, just like the front. So now I'm just going to connect the back. I'm going to make sure that the back is a lot higher than the front, just for more coverage, so I can easily wear my undergarments. So you can see that my collar for the front and the back is a bit different. So you have to indicate it because you are joining it. I'm going to be cutting it on fold. Don't worry, everything will make sense. Please, my back pattern has seaming allowance already. So I'm just going to use this paper and place under and just tap it. Don't worry, the paper has gum. So I'm just going to place it right there and tap it. So please don't forget that the front has to overlap a little just at this end. So I like to use about 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeter. Just that down part has to overlap a little, but the inner neckline, please don't overlap that. This is optional, but it gives a good fit. Don't worry, I'll touch on that when I'm doing Peter Pan collar. So another important thing to note, if you place your front pattern, if you're using the same style like mine, place your front on your back, you'll see that there's a major difference. The back is higher and the side too, it has more coverage than the front. So meaning on the collar, you would have to mark those. So it's time to indicate where they will all meet. Please note that the front will be cut on fold, same with the back, but there will be an opening at the back. So do well to place your pattern back and indicate those. I'd already indicated mine while drafting, so I know exactly where it is. So I'm going to use my pattern to cut my fabric. You want to fold your fabric on the bias. My fabric each is 4 to 5 inches. Since African print is 45 inches, so I decided to cut by 45 not to waste so much fabric. And that includes my length. It covers my length. So if you're having a longer length, if you want a longer length for your garment, please, you would have to add a bit of fabric. So right here, I'm just going to place my pattern. You see how everything makes sense now? You just placed your pattern just like so, and I'm going to pin and secure this in place before cutting it out. In case you're wondering how I'm going to get my gown length, don't worry, just keep watching. You will see everything. It's so simple when you do it this way. Now go ahead and place your collar. So you already know where the shoulder starts and where it stops. Sorry, I didn't know that it wasn't totally covered. So from your shoulder, go ahead and mark your desired dress length plus hemming allowance. So my desired dress length is 40 inches. So I'm adding extra 1 inch for seaming allowance. So now on the neckline, since I'll be attaching the main dress to the collar, so I'm going to mark half an inch. You can use 1/4 of an inch depending on how much you want to use and attach the dress to the collar. Now I'm just going to cut it out. So if your back and front neck design is the same, you can actually place this and cut all together. But since it wasn't the same, I just had to cut them separately. I still had some fabric left. So at the end of the day, I used about 2.5 yards for this. So another thing you can do while cutting, you can also place your other pattern, maybe the front or the back that you had cut out, just to make sure as long as their armhole align, you can just place it together and follow along and cut. This you can do if you are unsure of the length. Now that I've cut out my dress fabric, I am going to go ahead and cut out my collar pieces. But before cutting out my collar pieces, I am going to notch where my pocket will be. What is a dress without a pocket? So from the armhole, just measure 9 inches to 9.5 down. And that will be where the pocket will sit. 9 inches does the trick. 9.5 as well does the trick, depending on if you want it high or low. So that's where my pocket will sit. I'm just going to put this aside and work on the collar. So my leftover fabric is what I'm going to use and cut my collar. There is something I want to put out there. I know it might help someone. If you like your collar to sit nicely, it is advisable to cut it on the bias. It doesn't have to be bias, but you just have to cut it not on the straight grain. I don't know if it makes sense. So I'm just placing my collar. Remember that the front is on fold, while the back I'm going to add about ½ inch extra extension. This will be my seaming allowance, since the back will be open for me to get in and out of my dress easily. Another thing you would love to do is add seaming allowance to the down parts of your collar and the inner part of your collar. So I like to add ½ inch seaming allowance on the down part, but on the inner sometimes I use ¼ inch, but I'm going to be using ½ inch for this tutorial. The reason I'm using ½ inch for this tutorial is because I'm going to trim it down later. So if you have done all the marking, cut them out. I still have some leftover fabric, so it's time to cut my pocket. Remember that we had marked points for the pocket. So I'm going to make the opening of my pocket 8 inches, but anywhere from 7 inches is totally okay. So I'm just using my hand to trace out my pocket pattern. So just make sure you have a good opening that will include your seaming allowance. With that, I'm just going to cut out my pocket, and it's 4 pieces when it comes to this pocket. And I still have some fabric left that I can use and make strip. After all, I will need some strip in this tutorial. You can see how this fabric can be managed. So these are the strips I made out of my leftover fabric. I still made extra anyway. So right here, go ahead and notch where you will be attaching your collar to your dress. So I've already cut that out and I've notched them, and you can see my seaming allowance right there. So please, that is important. Do not forget to add seaming allowance, except you want a smaller collar. So this is my pocket, 4 pieces. I'm setting that aside, and of course this is my back piece I'll be working on right now, and my front piece. So let the stitching commence. So on the back piece right here, I am going to create an opening at the center back. So I'm marking 5 inches, and that will be an opening to aid the head to go in and out of the dress. So I've marked that. I'm just going to cut and stop at that. You can use the facing for this, but since I was using my leftover, so I'm going to be using a bias tape. So just use a bias tape to finish that. So now that it's nicely finished with the bias tape, it's time to attach the pocket. So you want to make sure that you place this pocket right side facing. Make sure you pin all the 4 pockets in place, and they're all right side facing. Then take to your sewing machine and stitch them all down. Now it's time to work on the armhole. So I'm using a bias again to work on my armhole. So you want to stitch it and turn it over to the wrong side. So I like to trim down a bit before turning it over. It just gives me a lot flatter look. So after working on my armhole, I've used a bias to finish it nicely. So I'm going to place my dress right side facing like so. You can pin this in place. You're going to stitch the side. When you get to the pocket, you go in and come out and you continue stitching. So it's basically you get to your pocket and you stitch your pocket. Make sure when you come back out, you continue with the seaming allowance you left, allocated seaming allowance. So this is how it looks after I've stitched. So you can go ahead and hem the down part, but I'm going to overlock that. So now it's time to work on the collar. So I have 2 collar pieces and I had notched where the dress will meet the collar because I am going to stitch the other part. So if you haven't notched, go ahead and notch. You just have to notch. So now for the topmost part that will be the front, that will be visible, I'm going to be attaching a fusible interface to it. So this is it. You can attach a fusible interface for both the back and the front, but I just decided to do it on one so that it can be obvious. I'm going to stitch the inside of my collar. So use your allocated seaming allowance to do the stitching. So I'm using pinkish hairs to trim this down. If you use the normal scissors, please do well to notch, please. So now it's time to stitch the other side. So the strip that I had made initially, I am going to stitch them up, turn them up right side out, and I'm going to fix them. I'm going to have a tie. My collar has a tie. You can use buttons. So all you need is just make a little loop. So for my down tie, I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch away from the end of my collar. Don't forget my seaming allowance is 1/2 inch. So you want to add 1/4 of an inch away from your seaming allowance for your tie to sit. While my first tie is close to my seam line up, it's just right under that seam line, but the second one is 3/4 of an inch away. 3/4, that's 0.75 away. So I'm going to stitch that in place, and I am going to stitch the side that the dress is not going in. You remember the part I asked you to notch? That is the part you are going to be stitching. So if you had notched, go ahead and pin that point so that you will know where to start and where to end. So you are going to use your seaming allowance and stitch this in place. So now after stitching in place, it's time to snip the corners because you can trim back on the seaming allowance. I use 1/2 inch, so I just had to trim it a bit. So just make sure that you snip this nicely. You can go ahead and even notch just for you to sit properly, and turn your collar right side out. I'll be showing you how I finish mine. You can go ahead and give your collar a press, but you have to note the center of your collar. I'd already note mine, and note the center of your dress because you have to match them up. So when you match them up, pin them nicely in place. So you are doing this to the right side of your fabric. If you can see, I am doing this to the part that I had added fusible interface on. So I'm going to take to my sewing machine and stitch this in place. You want to use your seaming allowance to stitch this in place. So after stitching it all down, you have two options. You can see it's flat, you can give that a press. You can go ahead and give your lining a press, that's the inner part of your collar, a press, and stitch it on top. And when you're stitching, you have to stitch on the ditch and make sure that it's slightly longer than the front so that it's going to catch it when you stitch on the ditch. That is one way you can do this. Another way is to fold it in and give it a press. It's not longer than the front, and you use thread and needle to pick that stitch and make sure it's secured. And this is the finishing I like to go for, because that way you don't have any thread visible. It's so nice, but it takes time though. But this is the finishing I like to go for when someone picks out a garment and doesn't know where you started and where you ended. The person just knows that the garment is neat. So just go ahead and stitch. So by the time you are done stitching, your garment will be properly concealed and you would love the finishing. And you're doing this both for the back and the front. So I decided to cut some fabric from my leftover to create a belt. And here is the final look. I love this dress. Thank you for watching to this point, and see you in the next tutorial. Bye for now.